Edward Whitmore controlled everything. A 46-year-old millionaire who ran his empire and his home with the same iron grip, scheduling his children's lives down to the minute. But returning early from Tokyo to his 22-room mansion, he found silence where there should have been laughter, empty rooms where his children should have been waiting. The staff exchanged nervous glances. The cook twisted her apron, and no one would meet his eyes when he demanded answers. Then, through his Mercedes window on a street he'd never traveled, Edward saw them, his precious heirs Oliver and Sophie, holding hands with Amara, their black maid, kneeling beside a homeless man. The rage that flooded through him was instant and absolute. These were his children, his rules, his perfectly controlled world, and this woman had shattered all of it. But as Edward stepped out of that car, ready to unleash his fury, he had no idea he was about to discover something about his late wife, Catherine, that would change everything. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The black SUV glided through the iron gates like a shadow returning home. Edward Whitmore sat in the leather interior, his fingers drumming against his thigh as familiar oak trees blurred past the tinted windows. 3 weeks in Tokyo had been exhausting. Merger talks, board meetings, endless negotiations. But he'd closed the deal 2 days early. He hadn't told anyone he was coming home ahead of schedule. Sometimes, Edward liked to see how his world operated when it didn't know he was watching. The driver pulled up to the circular driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Edward's estate sprawled before him. 22 rooms of limestone and glass, manicured hedges carved into perfect symmetry, fountains that whispered wealth with every drop of recycled water. This was his kingdom, built from 15 years of calculated risks and ruthless business decisions. Every stone, every blade of grass, every carefully placed sculpture existed because Edward Whitmore had willed it into being. He stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes meeting the driveway with practiced precision. The afternoon sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair, distinguished, his stylist called it. At 46, Edward wore success like a second skin. His suit, despite the 14-hour flight, remained crisp. Appearance mattered. Control mattered. Everything in Edward's life operated according to his design. The driver began unloading luggage, but Edward was already moving toward the entrance. In his mind, he could see it perfectly. Oliver and Sophie would hear the car. Their little feet would thunder down the marble staircase, and they'd crash into his arms with delighted squeals. Amara would be there too, standing in the doorway with that respectful smile she always wore, ready to take his coat and brief him on the household status during his absence. But when Edward pushed open the heavy oak door, silence greeted him. The foyer stretched before him, sunlight streaming through the crystal chandelier to create rainbow patterns on the floor. No children's laughter echoed off the high ceilings. No footsteps hurried to greet him. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. It sounded somehow too loud in the emptiness. "Oliver," Edward called out, his voice bouncing off marble surfaces. "Sophie." "Nothing." He set down his briefcase with a frown. The house felt different. Not wrong exactly, but shifted somehow, like a painting hung slightly crooked. Edward prided himself on noticing details others missed. It's what made him successful in business, this ability to sense when something was out of place. "Amara," his voice carried more authority now, the tone he used in board meetings when patience wore thin. Still nothing. Edward moved deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing. The living room sat pristine, throw pillows arranged with military precision on the imported Italian sofa. The dining room table gleamed, its surface reflecting the afternoon light. Everything appeared perfect, exactly as it should be, and yet, there, by the front door, he'd walked right past them without noticing. Toys. Sophie's stuffed rabbit lay abandoned on the floor, one button eye staring at the ceiling. Oliver's wooden train set scattered across the Persian rug, tracks disconnected, cars overturned. Edward's jaw tightened. His children knew better. Toys belonged in the playroom, not strewn about like common clutter. The kitchen door swung open at his touch, revealing Mrs. Patterson, the cook, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision. She looked up, and something flickered across her face. Surprise? Fear? It vanished before Edward could identify it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, setting down her knife carefully. "We weren't expecting you until Friday. Where are my children?" Edward didn't bother with pleasantries. He paid people for results, not small talk. Mrs. Patterson's hands found her apron, twisting the fabric. "They went out, sir." Out. The word tasted foreign in Edward's mouth. His children didn't just go out. Every activity was scheduled, supervised, documented. Ballet lessons on Tuesday, piano on Thursday, supervised playtime in the estate's private playground. "Out where?" "With Amara, sir." "Into town." Edward felt something cold settle in his chest. "Into town?" "She took my children into town without my permission." Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted toward the door like she wished she could disappear through it. She said something about errands, sir. "They left about an hour ago." "Errands." Edward repeated the word slowly, like he was tasting something bitter. In 3 years of employment, Amara had never taken such liberty. She was reliable, efficient, appropriate, qualities Edward valued in his staff. She understood boundaries, understood her place in the careful hierarchy of his household. Or so he'd thought. He pulled out his phone, jabbing at Amara's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before clicking to voicemail. Her professional voice greeted him. "You've reached Amara Johnson. Please leave a message, and I'll return your call as soon as possible." Edward ended the call without leaving a message. His hands had clenched into fists without him noticing. Did she say where specifically? He turned back to Mrs. Patterson, who seemed to be shrinking into herself. "No, sir. Just errands." Edward strode from the kitchen, anger building with each step. The playroom door flew open under his hand, revealing more chaos. Art supplies scattered across the craft table, cushions pulled from the reading nook to create some sort of fort, books lying open and abandoned. This wasn't just untidiness. This was disorder. This was everything Edward worked to prevent. He found Marcus, the chauffeur, in the garage, polishing the Mercedes. "I need you to drive me to town. Now." Marcus set down his cloth immediately. He'd worked for Edward long enough to recognize that tone. "Of course, sir." As the car pulled out of the estate, Edward sat rigid in the back seat, his mind racing through possibilities. Where would Amara take his children? The private shops on Madison Avenue where they had accounts? The organic grocery store that delivered their weekly orders? Surely she wouldn't take them anywhere inappropriate, anywhere common. "Sir." Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. "Any particular destination?" "Just drive through town. Main Street first." Edward stared out the window as pristine estates gave way to smaller homes, then to commercial buildings. His fingers drummed against his thigh again, a nervous habit he'd never been able to break. 3 years. 3 years Amara had worked for him without a single transgression. She arrived at 6:30 each morning, left at 8 each evening, unless he needed her to stay later. She kept the children fed, clean, educated according to his specifications. She was supposed to be molding them into proper heirs to the Whitmore legacy. "They were always so fond of her," Edward muttered, more to himself than Marcus. And they were. Sometimes too fond, Edward thought. Sophie would run to Amara with scraped knees instead of a nurse. Oliver shared his school stories with Amara first, Edward second. But that was natural, wasn't it? The help often became attached to the children they cared for. As long as boundaries remained clear, as long as everyone remembered their roles. "Slow down," Edward commanded suddenly. They'd entered a different part of town now, where buildings pressed closer together and signs advertised check cashing services instead of investment portfolios. Edward rarely came here. There was no reason to. This was where his workers lived, the people who cleaned his offices and maintained his properties. Necessary people, but separate from his world. Through the car window, Edward watched the street life. People sitting on stoops despite the afternoon heat, children playing in the spray of an open fire hydrant, music drifting from somewhere he couldn't identify. Foreign, chaotic. Everything his life was engineered to avoid. There, sir. Marcus pointed ahead, and Edward followed his gesture. His breath caught. There they were. His children, his carefully groomed, privately educated, heir-apparent children, walking hand in hand with Amara down this common street like they belonged here. Sophie's pristine white dress was already showing smudges of dirt. Oliver's neat hair had come loose, falling into his eyes, and Amara walked between them, holding their hands, her head high like she had every right to parade his children through this neighborhood. Stop the car. The Mercedes pulled to the curb with practiced silence, but Edward's exit was anything but subtle. The car door slammed with enough force to turn heads half a block away. He stood there for a moment, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the cracked sidewalk beneath his feet, his whole body rigid with disbelief. Amara was kneeling now, actually kneeling on the filthy concrete, and his children, were crouched beside her. In front of them sat a man Edward's brain automatically categorized as homeless. Weathered skin, clothes that had seen too many days without washing, a cardboard sign propped against a shopping cart filled with aluminum cans and plastic bottles. Edward watched, frozen, as Amara pulled something from her bag. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A bottle of water, still cold enough that condensation beaded on the plastic. She was showing Oliver how to offer it, her hand gentle on his small shoulder, guiding without forcing. "It's okay," Edward heard her say, her voice carrying that special softness she used when teaching the children something new. "Mr. Thomas isn't any different from you or me. He just needs a little kindness today." Sophie, his baby girl, his princess who had her own miniature tea set worth more than most people's monthly salary, was giggling. Actually giggling as she pulled a juice box from her tiny backpack, the designer one Edward had brought her from Milan. She held it out to the homeless man with both hands, like she was presenting a treasure. "Apple juice is my favorite," she announced in her clear, high voice. "Is it yours too?" The man, Thomas, apparently, smiled, revealing gaps where teeth should be. "Haven't had apple juice in a good long while, little miss." "Thank you kindly." Oliver, always the more serious of the two, tilted his head with that expression he got when puzzling through a math problem. "Mr. Thomas, why do you sleep outside? Don't you have a house?" Edward's chest tightened. This was exactly what he'd worked to prevent. His children being exposed to life's harsh realities before they were ready, before they were old enough to understand that some people made poor choices, that some people didn't work hard enough, that some people... Sometimes, Amara said gently, people lose their homes for reasons that aren't their fault. "Mr. Thomas used to work at the factory on Riverside Drive, didn't you?" The man nodded, accepting the sandwich with shaking hands. 32 years, until they closed it down. Been tough since then. 32 years is a long time, Oliver said solemnly. "That's like 4 of my whole lifetimes. More than 5 of mine," Sophie added, not to be outdone. They looked happy. That was the thing that stopped Edward's immediate charge forward, the thing that made him stand there staring like a fool. His children looked genuinely, radiantly happy. Sophie was bouncing slightly on her toes the way she did Christmas morning. Oliver's face had lost that careful, measured expression he usually wore, the one Edward recognized as his own, practiced and perfected over years of business dealings. "What on earth is going on here?" The words erupted from Edward before he could stop them, sharp enough to cut through the afternoon air. Everyone turned. Sophie's bounce stopped mid-motion. Oliver's shoulders hunched slightly. The homeless man shrank back. But Amara stood slowly, gracefully, positioning herself subtly between Edward and the children. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm like still water. "We weren't expecting you back until Friday." "That's obvious." Edward's voice could have frozen fire. "What I asked was what's going on. Why are my children here, in this?" He gestured at the street, the buildings, the entire neighborhood like it was contaminated. "Daddy." Sophie recovered first, running toward him with arms outstretched. "We made a friend. Mr. Thomas tells the best stories about trains, and Oliver loves trains, and..." Edward caught her before she could barrel into his legs, holding her at arm's length to inspect the damage. Dirt on her dress, definitely. Something sticky on her hands, probably from the juice box. Her hair had come loose from its neat braids, wisps sticking to her forehead in the heat. Oliver approached more slowly, reading the mood with the careful intuition children develop around volatile adults. We were learning about kindness, Dad. Amara says it's important to help people who need it. Does she? Edward's eyes found Amara over his son's head. She hadn't moved, still standing protectively near the homeless man as if Edward might be the danger here. And did Amara also explain that we have proper channels for charity? Tax-deductible donations, organized foundations, structured programs? They're learning kindness, sir, Amara said, and there was something in her voice Edward hadn't heard before. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of steady certainty. Not charity. There's a difference. The difference, Edward said, pulling both children closer to him, is that one is appropriate for children of their standing, and one is not. The homeless man, Thomas, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. Better her place than yours, seems to me. His voice was rougher than gravel, but his eyes were clear. At least she's teaching them to be human. Edward's face flushed hot. How dare this man, this nobody, presume to comment on his parenting? I don't recall asking for your opinion on. Daddy, no. Sophie twisted in his grip, her little face scrunched with distress. Mr. Thomas is nice. He shared his stories, even though he doesn't have much to share. That's what makes it special, Amara said. Amara said, Edward repeated, his voice rising. I'm your father. I decide what's special, what's appropriate, what's... He stopped, aware that people were watching from windows, from stoops, from the barber shop across the street. We're leaving. Now. He turned toward the car, pulling both children with him. But they resisted, actually resisted. Oliver's feet dragged, and Sophie twisted to look back at Amara. But we didn't finish. Oliver protested. We were going to help Mr. Thomas get his cart to the recycling center. Amara promised we could help push it, and Amara promises a lot of things, apparently. Edward's grip tightened. Things that aren't hers to promise. Please, Daddy. Sophie's voice had taken on that high, pre-tears pitch that usually got her whatever she wanted. Just 5 more minutes? We want to say goodbye properly. Amara taught us it's rude to leave without saying goodbye properly. For a moment, Edward almost laughed. His own lessons in proper etiquette, the expensive classes he'd enrolled them in, turned against him by their maid. But the laugh died in his throat when he saw how both children looked back at Amara, not him, for permission. Get in the car, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Both of you. Now. Oliver looked like he might argue, his small jaw set in an expression Edward recognized from a mirror. But Amara moved then, walking over with that same calm grace she always carried. It's all right, she said softly to the children. Go with your father. We'll talk later. But Sophie started. Remember what we discussed about respecting different perspectives? Amara's hand touched Sophie's cheek gently. This is one of those times. The fight went out of both children. They allowed Edward to guide them to the car, though Sophie kept looking back, waving at Mr. Thomas, who raised one weathered hand in return. Thank you for the juice, little miss, he called out. Brightest spot in my whole week. Edward ushered them into the back seat, his movements sharp with suppressed fury. Before he could follow, Amara spoke. They needed to see it, she said quietly, for his ears only. The world beyond those gates. That's not your decision to make, Edward hissed back. Maybe not, Amara agreed, her dark eyes steady on his. But someone needs to make it before it's too late. Edward slammed the car door without responding. As Marcus pulled away from the curb, he could see Amara in the side mirror, helping the homeless man to his feet, continuing whatever mission she'd apparently appointed herself to. Daddy, Oliver said from the back seat, his voice small. Why are you so angry? Edward's hands clenched in his lap. Because there are rules, Oliver. Rules about where you can go, who you can talk to, what's safe and what's not. But we were safe, Sophie piped up. Amara was with us, and Mr. Thomas was nice, and the lady at the corner store gave us free peppermints, and... The corner store? Edward's voice climbed again. Where else did she take you? The children exchanged glances, that secret communication between siblings that Edward remembered from his own childhood, before his brother died, before everything changed. Just places, Oliver said carefully. Normal places. There's nothing normal about. Edward stopped himself, aware of Marcus's eyes in the rearview mirror. He lowered his voice. We'll discuss this at home. The rest of the drive passed in uncomfortable silence. Sophie had started humming something under her breath, some tune Edward didn't recognize, probably something else Amara had taught them. Oliver stared out the window, watching the neighborhoods transform back into the manicured world Edward had built for them. As they pulled through the estate gates, Edward felt the familiar sense of control returning. This was his domain. Here, things operated according to his rules, his vision. The chaos of that street, the uncomfortable questions, the way his children had looked at that homeless man like he was just another person. All of that could be corrected. We'll be corrected. When we get inside, he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. You'll both wash thoroughly and change clothes. Then we'll have a family meeting about appropriate boundaries and the importance of staying where you belong. Where we belong, Oliver repeated, but there was something in his voice that made Edward glance back at him. His son was looking at the estate's perfect lawn, the sculptured hedges, the fountain that never stopped flowing, and his expression was thoughtful in a way that made Edward deeply uncomfortable. Yes, Edward said firmly, where you belong. But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the image of Sophie's joy as she handed over that juice box, or the way Oliver had calculated the man's years of service with such solemn respect. Worst of all, he couldn't forget how naturally they'd moved through that foreign street, like they'd been there before. Which, Edward realized with a cold certainty, they probably had. The car stopped. The house loomed before them, all those rooms of careful control. But something had shifted in the space of an afternoon. Some foundational stone Edward hadn't even known was loose. His children climbed out of the car slowly, reluctantly, like they were leaving something important behind. And maybe they were. The thought slipped through Edward's defenses before he could stop it. Maybe they all were. The mansion's heavy doors closed behind them with a sound like a judge's gavel. Edward strode directly to his study, his footsteps echoing off marble floors with military precision. Behind him, he could hear Sophie's small voice asking Amara why Daddy was upset, could hear Oliver's quieter questions about when they could go back to see Mr. Thomas. Edward's jaw clenched tighter with each word. His study was exactly as he'd left it. Dark wood panels, leather-bound books arranged by height and color, the massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. This room was his sanctuary, the nerve center from which he controlled an empire worth more than some small country's GDP. Edward dropped into his chair and immediately reached for his phone. Harrison, he barked when his lawyer answered on the first ring. I need you to review employment contracts. Specifically, the boundaries of household staff duties and grounds for immediate termination. Edward. James Harrison's voice carried the careful tone of someone who'd navigated Edward's moods for 15 years. What's happened? My maid decided to take my children on an unauthorized field trip to the slums. Edward's free hand was already pulling up Amara's employment file on his computer. I want to know exactly what recourse I have. The slums? Are the children hurt? No, but that's not. Edward stopped, forcing himself to breathe. Control. Always maintain control. They're fine physically, but she exposed them to inappropriate situations. Homeless individuals, unsanitary conditions. God knows what else. There was a pause on the other end. Did she endanger them? Was there neglect? Or she exceeded her authority? Edward interrupted. That should be enough. I'll review the contracts, Harrison said carefully. But Edward, if the children weren't harmed and she was supervising them the entire time, termination might be complicated, especially given her tenure and record. Edward ended the call without saying goodbye. 3 years. 3 years of perfect performance reviews. He'd even given her a raise 6 months ago when Sophie had started reading above grade level, crediting Amara's patient tutoring. How long had these unsanctioned excursions been happening? How blind had he been? A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Edward didn't look up from the computer screen. Not now. The door opened anyway. Only one person in the house would dare. The children are clean and changed, Amara said, standing in the doorway with that infuriating calm. They're having their afternoon snack. Pack your things, Edward said, still not looking at her. I'll have Harrison send your final check in. No. The word hung in the air between them. Edward's head snapped up, certain he'd misheard. Excuse me? Amara stepped into the study, closing the door behind her. She'd changed from her street clothes into her usual uniform. Pressed gray dress, sensible shoes, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. But something in her bearing was different. She stood taller, met his eyes directly. I said no. You won't fire me over this. Not when we both know I'm the only stability those children have. Edward stood slowly, using his full height advantage. You seem to have forgotten who you work for. I haven't forgotten anything. Amara's voice remained steady, including the fact that you've been gone 40% of the last year. Beijing, Tokyo, London, Dubai. I'm the one who holds Sophie when she has nightmares about losing another parent. I'm the one who helps Oliver with his anxiety about never being good enough for you. How dare you? I dare because someone has to. Amara moved closer to his desk, her hands clasped in front of her. Your children are growing up in a bubble, Mr. Whitmore. They're kind, intelligent, wonderful kids, but they have no idea how 99% of the world lives. Is that really what you want? To raise children who can't relate to anyone outside their tax bracket? Edward's hands flattened on the desk. I want to raise children who are prepared for their future, who understand excellence, discipline, success. And what about empathy? What about compassion? What about understanding that the people who clean their rooms and tend their gardens are human beings with stories and struggles? That's not. Edward stopped, running a hand through his hair. Through the study window, he could see the pool house, the tennis courts, the guest house that sat empty 11 months of the year. They'll learn about charity when they're older. Properly. Through foundations and galas. And writing checks isn't the same as seeing a person's face when you help them. Amara's voice softened slightly. Sophie didn't give Mr. Thomas juice because it was tax deductible. She did it because she saw he was thirsty. That's the kind of person she's becoming. Isn't that worth something? Edward turned away from her, staring at the wall of framed achievements. His MBA from Harvard, the covers of business magazines featuring his face, the photos with senators and celebrities. In the corner, almost hidden, was a single photo of his late wife, Catherine, holding infant Sophie while a toddler Oliver clung to her leg. Catherine would never have approved, he said quietly. Wouldn't she? The question made him turn back. Amara was looking at the same photo. Your wife volunteered at the Literacy Center downtown, Amara said. Every Tuesday, before Oliver was born. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it once. Edward felt something cold in his chest. He'd forgotten, or maybe he'd made himself forget. Those Tuesday evenings when Catherine would come home with paint on her fingers from helping with art projects, her eyes bright with stories about the kids she'd worked with. That was different, he said, but the words fell hollow. Was it, or did you just decide it had to be after she was gone? A sound from outside broke the moment. Children's voices. Edward moved to the window to see Oliver and Sophie in the garden, but they weren't playing. They were sitting on the grass, heads together, having what looked like a serious conversation. Even from here, Edward could see Oliver's protective arm around his sister's shoulder. They're worried about you, Amara said, coming to stand beside him. They don't understand why you're so angry about them making friends. Mr. Thomas is not their friend. He's a person who worked hard his whole life and lost everything through no fault of his own. Amara's reflection in the window watched him steadily. Is that really so threatening to you? Edward's phone buzzed. Another call from Harrison. He ignored it. There are rules, he said finally. Boundaries. They exist for a reason. Your rules. Your boundaries. Amara moved away from the window. But what if your children grow up and realize those boundaries were actually walls? What if they resent you for keeping them locked in this beautiful prison? It's not a prison. It's protection. From what? From understanding that their privileged life isn't the norm? From learning that their wealth comes with responsibility beyond writing checks? Edward turned to face her fully. You're out of line. Yes, Amara agreed. I am. But someone needs to be. Those children lost their mother 3 years ago. They can't afford to have a father who's so afraid of the world that he won't let them live in it. The words hit like physical blows. Edward sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. 3 years. Had it really been 3 years since Catherine's car accident? Some days it felt like yesterday. Other days like another lifetime. I made promises, he said quietly. At her funeral, I promised I'd keep them safe, give them everything, make sure they never wanted for anything. They don't want for anything, Amara said gently, except permission to care about others, except the chance to understand that their advantages can be used for more than just personal gain. A knock interrupted them. Sophie's voice carried through the door. Daddy? Amara? Can we come in? Edward looked at Amara, who raised an eyebrow as if to say your choice. He cleared his throat. Come in. Both children entered, Oliver still holding Sophie's hand protectively. They looked so small in the vast study, dwarfed by the heavy furniture and high ceilings. Daddy, Oliver started, his voice careful. We wanted to say we're sorry if we scared you. We didn't mean to. But also, Sophie added quickly, we want you to know that we were very safe and Amara always watches us, and Mr. Thomas was nice and... Sophie, Edward said, holding up a hand. She fell silent immediately, that trained response to authority that he'd cultivated. Come here, both of you. They approached slowly, uncertainly. Edward pulled them closer, one on each side of his chair. I need you to understand something, he began. The world outside these gates, it's not always safe. There are people who might want to hurt you, or use you, or... Mr. Thomas wouldn't hurt us, Sophie interrupted, then caught herself. Sorry, Daddy. He knew Mommy, Oliver said quietly. Edward's breath caught. What? Mr. Thomas. He recognized our last name. He said Mommy used to bring sandwiches to the factory sometimes, before it closed. He said she was kind. Edward stared at his son. Catherine had never mentioned. But then, there was so much about his wife's daily life he'd never asked about, too busy building his empire to notice her building her own quiet legacy of kindness. Is that true? He asked Amara. She nodded. I've heard similar stories from others in that neighborhood. Your wife was remembered fondly. Edward closed his eyes. He could feel Sophie leaning against his arm, could smell the lavender shampoo in her hair. When he opened his eyes, both children were watching him with expressions far too serious for their ages. New rules, he said finally. You don't go anywhere without my explicit permission. Amara is to stick to household duties only. No more unauthorized excursions. And you're not to leave the estate grounds unless I'm with you. Understood. Oliver's face fell. Sophie's lower lip trembled. But both nodded. Yes, Daddy, they chorused. Good. Now, go wash up for dinner. They left quietly, the energy drained from them like air from punctured balloons. Amara watched them go, then turned back to Edward. You're making a mistake, she said simply. It's my mistake to make. Edward turned back to his computer, dismissing her with his posture. Please ensure dinner is served at 6 sharp. Amara left without another word, but her absence seemed to fill the room more than her presence had. Edward stared at his screen, at spreadsheets and profit margins and acquisition proposals, but the numbers blurred together. All he could see was Sophie's joy as she handed over that juice box, Oliver's solemn calculation of years of service, the way both his children had moved through that street like they belonged there. Later, dinner was a quiet affair. The children picked at their food, organic, locally sourced, prepared to perfection, while Edward tried to maintain normal conversation about their studies and upcoming activities. But their responses were mechanical, their usual chatter replaced by dutiful answers. After the children were in bed, Edward found himself alone in his study again, a glass of 30-year-old scotch untouched on his desk. He pulled up his computer's photo files, scrolling back years until he found what he was looking for, pictures of Catherine he'd transferred from her phone after the accident. There she was at some community center, surrounded by children who clearly weren't theirs, her smile radiant as she helped a young girl with a painting. Another of her distributing food at what looked like a shelter. Another at that factory Oliver had mentioned, talking with workers during what must have been their lunch break. All these pieces of his wife he'd never known, or had known and forgotten, or had chosen to ignore because they didn't fit the narrative he'd built of their life together. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Camille. Heard you're back early. Also heard there was some drama with the help. Need me to recommend a new nanny? Edward deleted the message without responding. Through his window, he could see Amara's silhouette in the kitchen, preparing tomorrow's meals with the same careful attention she gave everything. 3 years she'd been raising his children while he traveled the world, making money they'd never be able to spend in 10 lifetimes. 3 years of her quietly filling the void Catherine had left, not replacing his wife, but creating her own space in his children's lives. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to Harrison, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted that too. Finally, he walked to the kitchen. Amara looked up from her prep work, her expression neutral. They need structure, he said without preamble. Boundaries. Protection. They need to be children, she countered. Real children who understand the real world. The real world will still be there when they're older. Will it? Or will they be so insulated by then that they won't be able to see it anymore? Edward had no answer for that. He turned to leave, then stopped. The community center Catherine volunteered at. Does it still exist? No, Amara said quietly. It closed 2 years ago. Funding dried up. Something twisted in Edward's chest. Another piece of his wife, erased while he wasn't paying attention. Good night, Amara. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. Edward climbed the stairs to his bedroom, passing the children's rooms on the way. He could hear Sophie whispering through her cracked door, probably to her stuffed animals. But as he listened closer, he realized she was talking to someone else, Oliver, through the connecting bathroom. Daddy doesn't understand, Sophie was saying. Amara's teaching us something important. I know, Oliver whispered back. But maybe we can help him understand. Somehow, Edward moved away from the door, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. In his bedroom, he stood at the window looking out at his estate. The perfect lawns, the precise gardens, the walls that kept the world at bay. Everything exactly as he designed it. But for the first time, he wondered if perfection might be another kind of prison. A week passed with the precision of a Swiss watch. Breakfast at 7, lessons at 8, lunch at noon, activities in the afternoon, dinner at 6, bedtime at 8:30. Edward had returned to his home office, conducting meetings via video conference rather than traveling, determined to re-establish order in his household. Every morning, he watched from his study window as Amara walked the children through their scheduled activities in the garden, noting with satisfaction that they remained within the estate's boundaries. But children are observant creatures, and Oliver and Sophie had begun to notice things their father missed. Daddy, Oliver said over breakfast on Tuesday morning, pushing his organic eggs around his plate. Why do some people have so much and others so little? Edward looked up from his Financial Times, caught off guard by the question. What brought this on? Oliver glanced at Sophie, who was carefully constructing a tower from her whole-grain toast triangles. We were just thinking about resources and distribution. From our economics lesson. Economics lesson? Edward frowned. You're studying basic math, not economics. Amara's been teaching us about resources, Sophie piped up, then caught herself. I mean, just as examples. Full math. Edward set down his newspaper slowly. Has she now? Both children suddenly found their plates fascinating. Edward made a mental note to review Amara's lesson plans more carefully. But before he could probe further, his phone rang. A crisis in the Singapore office that demanded immediate attention. By the time he'd handled it, the children had finished breakfast and started their morning studies with Amara in the library. What Edward didn't see was how Sophie had quietly slipped an extra apple and a granola bar into her school bag while he was distracted. Or how Oliver had carefully wrapped half his sandwich in a napkin when Amara took them for their garden walk later that morning. Remember, Amara said softly as they walked along the estate's back path, kindness doesn't need an audience. She led them to where Samuel, the gardener, was working on the rose beds. The elderly black man looked up with a warm smile that deepened the lines around his eyes. Well, look who's here, Samuel said, setting down his pruning shears. My favorite helpers. Oliver immediately moved to carry the bucket of mulch, his small arms straining with the weight but his face determined. Sophie began collecting the pruned rose clippings, careful of the thorns, just as Amara had taught her. "Tell us another story about your grandson, Mr. Samuel," Sophie requested as she worked. Samuel's face lit up. "Jerome? Oh, that boy. Did I tell you he's teaching himself to code? 12 years old and already building websites. Course, it's hard without a proper computer. He's been using the one at the library, but they limit the time." "That's not fair," Oliver said, frowning as he helped spread mulch. "I have my own laptop, and I barely use it except for homework." Amara caught his eye, saying nothing but nodding slightly. Oliver's frown deepened, the wheels clearly turning in his 8-year-old mind. "Mr. Samuel," Sophie asked, "why don't you just buy Jerome a computer?" Samuel chuckled, but there was something sad in it. "Sweet girl, computers cost money that goes to rent and food first. But Jerome, he doesn't complain. Says he'll earn one himself someday." "He sounds very responsible," Amara said, guiding the conversation gently. "Taking care of what needs doing before what he wants. That's real maturity." They worked together for another half hour, the children absorbing not just Samuel's stories, but the careful way he tended each plant, the pride he took in his work despite the ache Edward had heard him mention in his back. When it was time to go, both children hugged Samuel, which made the old man's eyes mist slightly. "You're raising them right," he told Amara quietly, glancing toward the main house where Edward's study window overlooked the gardens. "I'm trying," Amara replied, her voice equally soft. As they walked back, Oliver was unusually quiet. Finally, he tugged on Amara's sleeve. "My old laptop from last year. It still works. I just got a new one because the other was a year old. Could Jerome use it?" Amara knelt to his level. "That's a beautiful thought, Oliver. But that laptop belongs to your father. What would need to happen first?" "I need to ask permission," Oliver said slowly. Then, his face falling, "But Daddy would want to know why, and if I told him about Mr. Samuel's grandson." "He might not understand," Sophie finished for him. Amara stood, taking both their hands. "Sometimes doing right is complicated, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. We just have to be creative." That afternoon, while Edward conducted a lengthy conference call with investors, Amara taught the children to bake bread. But it wasn't just any bread. It was enough for several loaves. "Why are we making so much?" Sophie asked, flour dusting her nose. "Because bread shared tastes better than bread hoarded," Amara replied, showing them how to knead the dough properly. "And because Mrs. Patterson's church is having a bake sale for their food pantry." "What's a food pantry?" Oliver asked. As the bread rose, Amara explained, carefully, gently, about families who sometimes ran out of food before payday, about children who only ate full meals at school, about elderly people choosing between medicine and groceries. The children listened with wide eyes, occasionally glancing toward the pantry shelves that held more food than their small family could eat in months. "But why doesn't someone just give them food?" Sophie asked. "People do," Amara said. "That's what food pantries are for. People who have extra share with people who need it. It's how communities take care of each other." That evening at dinner, Edward noticed both children eating everything on their plates. Unusual, especially for Sophie, who was typically picky. "Someone's hungry tonight," he commented. Sophie looked at her clean plate thoughtfully. "It feels wrong to waste food when some people don't have enough." Edward paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Where did that come from?" "Just thinking," Sophie said quickly, glancing at Amara, who was refilling water glasses with perfect neutrality. Later that night, Edward stood in his study reviewing security footage from the day, a new habit he'd developed since the street incident. He watched Amara with the children in the garden, saw them helping Samuel, noticed how they lit up when the old gardener told his stories. There was nothing technically wrong with what he saw. The children had remained on the estate. They'd been supervised. They'd even gotten fresh air and exercise. So why did it make him uneasy? His phone buzzed. An email from Oliver's teacher, praising his recent essay about community responsibility. "Such mature thinking for an 8-year-old, she'd written. "You must be having wonderful discussions at home." Edward hadn't discussed anything of the sort with Oliver, which meant he walked quietly to the children's wing of the house. Their bedtime had passed an hour ago, but he could hear soft voices from Sophie's room. He stood in the hallway, listening. "Tell it again," Sophie was saying. The story about the boy who shared his lunch. Oliver's voice was patient, like he'd told this story many times. There was once a boy who only had 5 small loaves and 2 fish. But instead of keeping them for himself when everyone was hungry, he shared them. And somehow, there was enough for everyone. Amara says that's called a miracle of generosity, Sophie added sleepily. She says miracles happen when people choose to share instead of hoard. Edward retreated to his bedroom, his mind churning. Amara wasn't violating his direct orders. The children weren't leaving the estate. But she was still teaching them, still shaping their worldview in ways he hadn't authorized. The smart thing would be to fire her immediately, find someone who would follow his instructions to the letter. But he remembered the dead look in his children's eyes that first night after he'd laid down the new rules. And now, gradually, life had returned to them. They were asking questions, thinking about others becoming, what? More human? The thought disturbed him because it implied they'd been less human before. The next morning, Edward decided to test something. At breakfast, he mentioned casually, "I'm thinking of donating some of our old electronics to charity. Tax write-off, you know." Oliver's head snapped up so fast, he nearly knocked over his orange juice. "Really? Which charity?" "Oh, I haven't decided. Probably just have Harrison handle it through the company foundation." Oliver's excitement dimmed slightly, but he pressed on. What if we knew someone specific who needed something? Would that be better than just giving it to a random charity? Edward pretended to consider this. "Do you know someone who needs something?" Oliver glanced at Amara, who was quietly preparing Sophie's lunch bag. She gave no sign she was listening. "Maybe," Oliver said carefully. "Samuel's grandson needs a computer for coding. He's teaching himself, but he can only use the library's computer for an hour at a time." "Samuel's grandson?" Edward kept his voice neutral. "How do you know about Samuel's grandson?" "He tells us stories sometimes," Sophie chimed in. "When we help him in the garden. Jerome sounds really smart and hardworking." Edward studied his children. A week ago, they wouldn't have known Samuel had a grandson. They certainly wouldn't have cared about his lack of a computer. "I'll think about it," he said finally. The joy that bloomed on both children's faces was immediate and genuine. Oliver actually bounced in his seat, and Sophie clapped her hands together. "Really, Daddy? You'll really think about it?" "I said I would." As he returned to his study, Edward caught Amara's eye. She inclined her head slightly, not quite a nod, certainly not approval, just acknowledgement. The next few days continued in this pattern. The children stayed within bounds physically, but expanded beyond them mentally and emotionally. They helped Mrs. Patterson organize the pantry and quietly set aside cans and boxes for the church food drive. They practiced their music lessons with new dedication because Amara mentioned how music could bring joy to people in nursing homes. They even started a small vegetable garden in a corner of the estate, insisting they wanted to grow food to share. Edward watched it all from his study window, torn between admiration and alarm. His children were changing, becoming more thoughtful, more engaged, more like their mother. The thought ambushed him one afternoon as he watched Sophie carefully watering the tiny seedlings, her face serious with responsibility. Catherine would have loved this. She would have been right there in the dirt with them, teaching them exactly what Amara was teaching them now. That evening, he called Oliver to his study. "About Samuel's grandson," he began. Oliver stood very straight, hope radiating from every line of his small body. "I'll allow you to give him your old laptop. On one condition." "Anything, Dad. You write a letter to go with it, explaining why you're giving it to him, what you hope he'll do with it. And you'll meet him when you give it to him, properly, with me there." Oliver's face went through a series of expressions: joy, worry, calculation, and finally determination. "Yes, sir. I can do that. Thank you, Daddy." The boy actually hugged him, a spontaneous gesture that caught Edward off guard. When had his children stopped hugging him spontaneously? "Can I tell Sophie?" Oliver asked breathlessly. "Go ahead." Oliver raced from the room. Moments later, Edward heard delighted squeals from the children's wing. He sat back in his chair, staring at the spot where his son had stood. Such a small thing, giving away an old laptop. But the joy it had brought? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Amara entered with his evening coffee. "Thank you," she said simply, setting the cup on his desk. "I haven't done anything yet." "You've done more than you know." She turned to leave, then paused. "Jerome is a good boy. Reminds me of Oliver in some ways. Curious, determined, eager to learn. They might become friends. Is that what this is about? Arranging friendships for my children?" Amara turned back to face him fully. "It's about letting them see that friendship doesn't require a certain bank account balance. That worth isn't measured in dollars." "Easy to say when you have dollars," Edward countered. "Yes," Amara agreed, "which is why it's even more important that those who have them understand their real value. Your children are learning that, Mr. Whitmore. The question is whether you'll learn it with them or be left behind." She left before he could respond, but her words echoed in the empty study. Edward looked at the family photo on his desk. Him, Catherine, and the children at some charity gala 2 years before the accident. They were all dressed perfectly, smiling perfectly, positioned perfectly. But he couldn't remember anything about that night, except that he'd left early for a conference call with Tokyo. Outside his window, twilight was falling over the estate. Somewhere in the house, his children were probably whispering about tomorrow's chance to meet Jerome, to deliver the laptop, to make a new friend. They were excited about giving something away, about helping someone else, about connecting with a world beyond these walls. Despite himself, Edward felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. Or perhaps it was just recognition, seeing Catherine's heart beating in their children's chests, kept alive by an unlikely teacher who understood what he'd forgotten, that wealth meant nothing if it built walls instead of bridges. Tomorrow, he would meet Samuel's grandson. He would watch his son give away something valuable and count it as gain. He would take one small step toward the world Amara was secretly showing his children, the world Catherine had never really left. But tonight, he sat in his perfect study in his perfect house, wondering when perfection had become so perfectly empty. The following Saturday arrived gray and humid, with clouds that promised rain but wouldn't deliver. Edward had agreed to accompany the children to deliver Oliver's laptop to Jerome, telling himself it was simply good parenting to supervise such interactions. He'd even had his assistant research Samuel's family, confirming that Jerome was indeed a bright 12-year-old with excellent grades despite attending an underfunded public school. But as they prepared to leave, Amara made an unexpected suggestion. "Since you're already going out," she said, helping Sophie with her jacket, "perhaps you could drop these extra baked goods at the community shelter. It's on the way." Edward looked at the 2 large boxes she indicated. Community shelter? The one Mrs. Patterson's church supports. Sophie and Oliver helped make the bread yesterday. Amara's expression was perfectly innocent, but Edward had learned to be suspicious of that particular look. "Please, Daddy." Sophie tugged at his hand. "We worked really hard on it. 3 whole hours of kneading and waiting and kneading again." Against his better judgment, Edward agreed. It was just dropping off some bread. How complicated could it be? The shelter sat on Madison Street, a part of town Edward passed through but never really saw. The building itself was older, brick and mortar that had witnessed better decades, with a hand-painted sign that read Hope Harbor Community Shelter, in cheerful, if amateur lettering. Edward parked his Mercedes conspicuously among the older vehicles, already regretting this decision. But the children were practically vibrating with excitement, and Amara was lifting the boxes from the trunk with practiced ease. "I'll wait in the car," Edward said. "The boxes are heavy," Amara replied simply. "And there are steps," which is how Edward found himself following his children and their nanny up worn concrete steps, carrying a box that smelled of fresh bread while trying to ignore the curious looks from people lounging near the entrance. The moment they entered, Edward realized this was a mistake. But it was too late. Sophie had already run forward with a delighted cry of "Ms. Janet," throwing her arms around a heavy-set black woman who caught her with practiced ease. "Sophie girl. And Oliver. Oh, we've missed you too." Janet's eyes found Amara over the children's heads. "Thought we might not see you again after." She trailed off, noticing Edward standing frozen in the doorway, his expensive suit making him look like he'd been photoshopped into the scene. "This is our daddy," Oliver said, pride and nervousness mixing in his voice. "Daddy, this is Ms. Janet. She runs the kitchen here." Janet's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on cautious politeness. "Mr. Whitmore, heard a lot about you." Edward bet she had. "None of it probably good." "We brought bread," Sophie announced, tugging Janet toward the boxes. 12 loaves? Amara taught us to make extra because sharing makes it taste better. "Bless your heart, baby. Come on, let's get these to the kitchen." Edward found himself swept along by the momentum of his children's enthusiasm. The shelter's main room opened before him, a large space with mismatched tables and chairs, walls covered in children's artwork and faded motivational posters. It was clean but worn, everything showing signs of being used hard and maintained carefully. And it was full. Families clustered at tables, children playing in a corner with toys that had seen better days, elderly people sharing coffee and conversation. The smell of something, soup, maybe, drifted from the kitchen. "Oliver, Sophie," a chorus of young voices called out, and suddenly Edward's children were surrounded by other kids, all talking at once. His children knew these kids, knew their names, their stories, were greeting them like old friends. "Daddy, look." Sophie dragged him toward the group. "This is Lulu, and that's her brother Jace. Remember, we told you about them? And this is Maria, and that's Deshawn, and—" Edward's head spun as Sophie rattled off names, but one stopped him cold. Jace, the boy from the street, the one who'd asked if Edward was going to help. He was Oliver's age, but smaller, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything. "You came back," Jace said to Oliver, then looked at Edward. "You too. We brought bread," Oliver said quickly, as if to justify their presence. "And guess what? My dad's letting me give Jerome my old laptop." "Really?" An older boy Edward assumed was Jerome appeared, Samuel's features clear in his face. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, thank you. Thank you so much." The genuine gratitude in the boy's voice made Edward uncomfortable. It was just an old laptop, outdated technology he would have recycled anyway. "Oliver wanted to help," he said stiffly. "Come see what I've been working on." Jerome pulled Oliver toward an ancient desktop computer in the corner. "I've been teaching myself Python, but the library computer is so slow." Edward watched his son light up as Jerome showed him basic coding, the two boys bonding immediately over technology. Sophie had been pulled into some sort of craft project with Lulu and Maria, their heads bent together over construction paper and safety scissors. "First time here." Edward turned to find a white woman in her 50s watching him, her expression knowing. She wore jeans and a volunteer t-shirt, her gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm Ellen, the director here. Your children, though, they're regulars. Or were, until about 2 weeks ago." She glanced at Amara, who was helping in the kitchen. "Amara's been bringing them for months. They're quite beloved here." Months. The word hit Edward like cold water. Months of his children coming here, building relationships, living a whole life he knew nothing about. "I didn't know," he said, more to himself than to Ellen. "Parents often don't," Ellen said gently. "We're all so busy, aren't we? Easy to miss what's happening right under our noses." She paused. "Would you like a tour?" Edward wanted to say no, wanted to collect his children and leave. But Oliver and Sophie were so happy, so engaged. And people were watching him, not with hostility exactly, but with curiosity. The rich man in their midst, the father of children they apparently knew better than he did. "All right," he heard himself say. Ellen led him through the shelter, narrating with the practiced ease of someone used to giving tours to potential donors. Here was the clothing closet, where families could get free clothes and shoes. There was the computer room, with its ancient machines held together by determination and duct tape. The quiet room where children could do homework. The food pantry, shelves half empty despite the church donations. "We serve about 200 families a month," Ellen explained. "More since the Riverside factory closed." The factory again. Mr. Thomas's factory. Edward wondered how many of these people had worked there. They paused at a bulletin board covered in documents. Our programs, Ellen said with pride that couldn't quite mask exhaustion. Or what's left of them. We used to have literacy nights, job training, after-school tutoring. But funding, she shrugged. Edward's eye caught on a faded document, a lease agreement. The building address looked familiar. He pulled out his phone, did a quick search, and his stomach dropped. The building was owned by Whitmore Holdings, one of dozens of properties in their real estate portfolio. You rent from Whitmore Holdings, he said slowly. Ellen's expression tightened. For now, we got a notice last month. Rent's going up 40% next quarter. We're trying to negotiate, but... Another shrug, this one defeated. Edward stared at the notice. It bore the signature of Victor Hale, his COO. Standard procedure. Maximize profit from every asset. He'd probably signed off on dozens of similar increases without thinking about it. Daddy, Sophie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She came running, holding a painted picture, handprints made into a rainbow. Look what Lulu and I made. It's for the wall, to make people happy when they come in. Her hands were covered in paint, her dress probably ruined. 2 weeks ago, Edward would have been furious. Now he just felt hollow. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Mr. Whitmore. Amara appeared at his elbow. The children are helping serve lunch. Would you like to observe? It wasn't really a question. Edward followed her to the kitchen, where Oliver and Sophie had put on aprons and were ladling soup into bowls with careful concentration. Janet supervised, guiding their small hands. Not too full. Oliver, baby, we need to make sure everyone gets some, she said gently. That's it, perfect. Edward watched his son nod seriously, adjusting his portion size. Watched Sophie carefully hand bowls to waiting people. Here you go. Enjoy your lunch, chirped with genuine warmth. Watched both his children see the people they were serving, really see them, not as charity cases or statistics, but as individuals. Your mother would be proud, someone said beside him. Edward turned to find Mr. Thomas, cleaned up, wearing different clothes, but unmistakably the man from the street. He held a bowl of soup Oliver had just served him. You knew her? Edward asked. Met her a few times when she'd visit the factory. Always remembered people's names, asked about our families. Thomas studied Edward with those clear eyes. She ever tell you about the Christmas party she threw for the factory kids? Rented out the whole community center, had Santa and everything. Edward's throat felt tight. No, she didn't. Probably didn't seem important enough, Thomas said, not unkindly. You were always so busy building your empire. She was busy building something else. The simple touch of a child's hand on Edward's expensive sleeve made him freeze. Jay stood there, the same boy from the street, his eyes earnest and hopeful. Sir, are you going to help us too? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, the shelter bustled with activity, volunteers serving food, families eating together, his own children moving through it all like they belonged. Edward's mouth opened, but no words came. He cleared his throat, aware that conversations had quieted, that people were watching. What kind of help do you need? It was the wrong question, too corporate, too transactional. But Jace just tilted his head thoughtfully. My mom needs a job, he said simply. She's really smart and works hard, but nobody will hire her since the factory closed. Edward's automatic response, that he didn't handle hiring personally, that there were procedures and qualifications, died in his throat. This 8-year-old boy wasn't asking for a handout. He was advocating for his mother with more dignity than most adults Edward knew. Maybe, Edward faltered, then felt Amara's steady presence beside him. Maybe I could look into it. What did she do at the factory? Quality control, Jace said, brightening. She was the best. Never missed a defect. Mr. Thomas said so. Thomas nodded from his table. Grace has the sharpest eyes I ever saw. Could spot a flaw from across the floor. Grace. The name humanized her, made her real in a way that Jace's mom hadn't. Edward found himself nodding slowly. I'll see what I can do. The smile that broke across Jace's face was like sunrise. Really? You mean it? He means it, Amara said quietly, and something in her tone suggested that Edward better mean it. Ellen appeared then, diplomatically redirecting Jace to his lunch while gesturing for Edward to follow her. "Since you're here, Mr. Whitmore, perhaps you'd like to see our storage room. We could use some help with the heavy lifting." It wasn't a request. Edward found himself following her to a back room where boxes of donations waited to be sorted. Without asking, Ellen handed him a box cutter. "Canned goods on the left shelf, dry goods on the right," she instructed, then left him there. For a moment, Edward just stood, holding the box cutter like a foreign object. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done manual labor. But through the doorway, he could see Oliver carefully wiping down tables while Sophie stacked chairs with another little girl. If his 6-year-old could stack chairs. He opened the first box. Canned soup, green beans, corn. Simple enough. He began placing them on the designated shelf. Try not to think about the spreadsheet on his desk showing Whitmore Holdings' quarterly profits from their real estate division. "You're doing it wrong." Edward turned to find Amara watching him, amusement in her eyes. "I'm putting cans on a shelf. How can I be doing it wrong? Labels out, older dates in front, so they get used first." She moved beside him, demonstrating. Like this. They worked in silence for a moment, Edward copying her movements. The simple repetition was oddly soothing. "How long?" he asked finally. "How long have you been bringing them here?" 6 months, Amara replied, not pretending to misunderstand. "Started small, just driving through the neighborhood, pointing things out. Then we met some kids at the park whose moms were picking up food here. Sophie wanted to see where their food came from. And you just decided to make it regular?" "Your children decided. I just facilitated." She paused in her sorting. "They have good hearts, Mr. Whitmore. Hearts that want to help, to connect, to understand. I couldn't tell them no. You could have told me. Could I?" Amara's voice was gentle but pointed. "When would I have told you? During your Hong Kong trip? The merger negotiations? The weekend you spent locked in your study restructuring the Chicago division?" Each example hit like a small blow. Edward focused on the cans, arranging them with unnecessary precision. "Daddy, come see." Sophie appeared in the doorway, grabbing his hand before he could respond. She pulled him to the main room, where someone had set up an old CD player. Music played, something cheerful and slightly tinny, and children were dancing, including Oliver, who normally avoided any activity that might make him look foolish. "Dance with me, Daddy." Sophie was already moving, her little body bouncing to the beat with complete abandonment. Edward stood stiffly, aware of every eye in the room. "I don't really. Please." How could he refuse those eyes? Catherine's eyes looking up at him from their daughter's face. Edward let Sophie take both his hands, let her pull him into simple movement. Around them, other parents danced with their children, parents in worn clothes with tired faces but genuine smiles. "Mr. Whitmore's got moves," someone called out, and laughter rippled through the room. Not mocking laughter, but warm, inclusive. Edward found himself relaxing slightly, letting Sophie spin under his arm. Oliver grabbed his other hand, and suddenly he was dancing with both his children in a community shelter while Amara watched from the kitchen doorway with something that might have been approval. The song ended, and Edward was surprised to find himself breathless and almost smiling. Jace's little sister Lulu tugged at his sleeve. "You're tall like my daddy was," she said matter-of-factly. "Can you help me get my picture from the tall shelf?" Lulu, her mother, Grace, Edward remembered, appeared, looking mortified. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore. She doesn't understand." "It's fine," Edward said, surprising himself. He looked down at Lulu. "Show me which picture." The little girl led him to a shelf where children's artwork was displayed. Her picture was indeed on the highest shelf, a crayon drawing of a house with a garden and a smiling family. "That's our dream house," Lulu explained as Edward retrieved it. "Mama says if she gets a job, maybe we can have a garden someday." Edward looked at Grace, really looked at her. Mid-30s, he guessed, with intelligent eyes and careful posture that spoke of someone trying to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances. Her clothes were clean but worn, her shoes repaired with tape at one seam. "Jace mentioned you worked in quality control," he said. Grace's spine straightened. "Yes, sir. 15 years. Perfect record, no missed effects, implemented 3 process improvements that saved the factory money." She rattled off her qualifications like she'd rehearsed them, like she'd been ready for this chance that never came. Edward pulled out his phone, opened his calendar. Monday, 10 a.m., Whitmore Holdings headquarters. Ask for my assistant, Margaret. Tell her I sent you. Grace's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Are you serious? We have a quality control position open in our electronics division. I can't promise anything, but you'll get a fair interview. Daddy's helping, Sophie announced to the room at large, and Edward felt heat rise to his face as people turned to look. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Thank you so much. I won't let you down, I promise. Mama's going to get a job, Lulu shouted, and suddenly the whole shelter was looking at them, some clapping, some wiping their eyes. Edward wanted to sink into the floor. This wasn't how he operated, public gestures, emotional displays. But Oliver took his hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. That was good, Dad, his son said quietly. That was really good. Ellen appeared with a clipboard. While you're in such a generous mood, Mr. Whitmore, perhaps you'd like to see our budget, especially the line about next quarter's rent increase. She said it lightly, but her eyes were serious. Edward took the clipboard, scanning the numbers with practiced efficiency. The shelter operated on less per month than he spent on wine for his cellar. And the rent increase, his company's rent increase, would effectively destroy them. He stopped, unsure what to say. Reality, Ellen finished. This is reality for us. Every month, calculating whether we can afford to keep the lights on and serve meals. Every month, turning people away because we don't have enough. Edward looked around the room, at the families finishing their lunch, at volunteers cleaning up with cheerful efficiency, at his own children helping stack dishes. His eye caught the wall of photos, pictures from events, programs, celebrations. In one, he recognized the building from a different angle, a banner across it reading Riverside Factory Company Picnic. This used to be the factory's community center, he said slowly. Until it closed, Ellen confirmed. The shelter took it over 5 years ago, trying to serve the families who lost everything when the jobs disappeared. 5 years ago, when Whitmore Holdings had bought the factory property and shut it down, moving operations overseas for better profit margins. Edward remembered signing those papers, remembered the projected savings, remembered celebrating the quarterly earnings that followed. He handed the clipboard back, his hand unsteady. I need to make a call. He stepped outside, the humid air hitting him like a wall. His phone felt heavy as he dialed Victor Hale's number. Edward, Victor's smooth voice answered. Unusual to hear from you on a Saturday. The Madison Street shelter, Edward said without preamble. The rent increase. Cancel it. There was a pause. I'm sorry, what? You heard me. Cancel the rent increase. Edward, that's a 40% revenue increase on an underperforming property. The board will understand when I explain it as a community relations investment. Edward cut him off. Cancel it, Victor. This is highly irregular. If I might ask what brought this on. Edward looked through the window at his children, saw Sophie teaching Lulu some sort of hand-clapping game, while Oliver and Jerome worked together on the ancient computer. My children are inside, he said simply. Edward, are you at the shelter? The actual shelter. Cancel the rent increase, Victor. Monday morning. Email me confirmation. He hung up before Victor could respond, then stood in the humid afternoon, trying to reconcile the man who'd signed those factory closure papers with the father watching his children serve soup to displaced workers. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Camille. Heard you're slumming it with the kids. Have you lost your mind? Edward deleted it without responding and went back inside. The afternoon was winding down. Families were leaving, volunteers cleaning up. Oliver and Sophie were saying elaborate goodbyes to their friends, making promises to come back soon, promises Edward wasn't sure he could let them keep. Mr. Whitmore, Ellen said, approaching with a worn photo album. I thought you might like to see these. She opened it to a marked page. There was Catherine, Edward's wife, surrounded by children at what was clearly a Christmas party. She wore a ridiculous elf hat, and her smile was radiant. Another photo showed her serving food at what looked like Thanksgiving, another reading to a group of toddlers. She came every week for 2 years, Ellen said softly. before Oliver was born. She was going to start bringing him when he was old enough, but she died. The accident happened, and Edward had buried himself in work, in control, in keeping his children safe from a world that had taken their mother. I didn't know, he said, his voice rough. She probably thought you were too busy to care, Thomas said, appearing at his elbow. Not accusingly, just stating a fact. Edward admitted, the words bitter. I was too busy. He looked at the shelter, really looked at it. Saw past the worn furniture and patched walls to what it actually was, a place where people took care of each other, where dignity was preserved despite circumstances, where his children had learned lessons he'd never thought to teach them. Can I keep this? He asked Ellen, pointing to one of the photos of Catherine. Of course. As they prepared to leave, Sophie ran back to hug Lulu one more time. Oliver gave Jerome the laptop with a formal handshake that turned into a hug, and Amara quietly confirmed with Ellen that the bread delivery would continue weekly. Mr. Whitmore, Grace approached nervously. About Monday, 10 a.m., Edward confirmed. Don't be late. I won't. Thank you. As they walked to the car, Oliver slipped his hand into Edward's, a gesture he hadn't made in months. Dad, can Jace come to our house for dinner? The question hung in the air as Edward opened the car door. He thought about his pristine dining room, his carefully controlled world, the walls he'd built to keep exactly this kind of request from happening. I'll think about it, he said, and realized he actually would. Edward woke Sunday morning to his phone vibrating like an angry wasp. 17 missed calls from Victor, 12 from board members, 43 unread messages in the executive group chat. He reached for his phone, then stopped. Through his bedroom window, he could hear Sophie's laughter from the garden, Oliver's voice explaining something about coding to someone. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to find both children in the kitchen with Amara, making what appeared to be sandwich assembly lines. Morning, Daddy, Sophie chirped, peanut butter smeared on her cheek. We're making lunches for tomorrow. Tomorrow? Edward poured himself coffee, ignoring his phone's continued buzzing. For the shelter, Oliver explained, carefully spreading jelly. Ms. Janet said Mondays are hard because the food bank is closed on Sundays, so people are extra hungry. Edward's phone rang again. Victor's name flashed on the screen. I need to take this, Edward said, stepping into his study. Finally, Victor's voice was ice cold. Edward, what the hell are you thinking? Good morning to you too, Victor. Just don't. I've been fielding calls all morning. Someone posted a photo of you at that shelter. Dancing, Edward. Dancing. With the caption, Billionaire finally discovers where his tenants live. Edward pulled up social media on his laptop. There was a slightly blurry photo of him dancing with Sophie and Oliver, Amara visible in the background. The comments ranged from skeptical to scathing. It's already been shared 8,000 times, Victor continued. PR is in crisis mode. The board is demanding an emergency meeting. And you want to cancel a legitimate rent increase? Do you understand what this looks like? It looks like a man spending Saturday with his children, Edward said evenly. It looks like instability. It looks like you've lost control. It looks like Victor paused. Wait, is that why the maid was there? Did she orchestrate this? Something cold settled in Edward's stomach. What are you implying? I'm implying that maybe your domestic staff has overstepped boundaries. Maybe it's time for a change. I could have a new agency send candidates by tomorrow. Victor, Edward's voice dropped dangerously low. You will not make personnel decisions for my household. Someone needs to make decisions, because you're clearly not thinking straight. That shelter? It's a liability. Those people are. Those people include former employees from the Riverside factory, the one we closed. Silence on the other end. Then, that was a sound business decision that increased profits by 32% and destroyed how many lives? That's not our concern. Our concern is shareholder value. Edward looked through his study door at his children, still making sandwiches with Amara's gentle guidance. Maybe it should be our concern. I'm calling an emergency board meeting, Victor said. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Be there, Edward, and come prepared to explain yourself. The line went dead. Edward set down his phone and found Amara standing in the doorway. Problems? She asked quietly. Nothing I can't handle. But his voice lacked conviction. That afternoon, while the children napped, Edward found himself in the mudroom. Amara was there, quietly washing the children's shoes, the ones they'd worn to the shelter, caked with city dust and traces of paint from Sophie's art project. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's my job," she replied simply, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn spot. "Is it?" Edward leaned against the doorframe. "Is any of this really your job?" Amara paused in her scrubbing. "Taking care of your children is my job. Sometimes that means more than just feeding and clothing them. My board thinks you've overstepped. They want you fired. And what do you think?" Edward didn't answer immediately. He watched her careful hands cleaning his children's shoes, thought about all the meals she'd prepared, all the tears she'd dried, all the lessons she'd taught. "I think my wife would have liked you," he said finally. Amara looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Ellen showed you the photos." "She did." Edward moved to sit on the mudroom bench. "Catherine never told me about the shelter, about any of it." "Maybe she tried," Amara suggested gently. "Sometimes people hear without listening." Edward thought back, searching his memory. Had there been times Catherine tried to share this part of her life? Times he'd been too busy with acquisitions and mergers to really hear her? "There's something else you should know," Amara said, returning to her scrubbing. "About the shelter, about why I started taking the children there." She paused, seeming to gather herself. 5 years ago, my family was evicted. My mother had been sick, medical bills piled up, and we couldn't make rent. The shelter took us in. For 3 months, that was home. Edward stared at her. "You were homeless?" "I prefer to say I was between homes," Amara said with dignity. "I had just finished my degree in early childhood education, but couldn't find work that paid enough for first and last month's rent anywhere. Ellen helped me get the position with the Brennans, and when they moved to London, they recommended me to you. I had no idea. Why would you? My references were impeccable, my background check clean. Being poor isn't a crime, Mr. Whitmore, though sometimes it's treated like one." Edward's phone buzzed again. A text from Camille. "The photo is everywhere. Call me now." He ignored it. "The board meeting tomorrow," he said. "They'll want me to distance myself from the shelter. Cancel the rent freeze, fire you, return to normal." "And will you?" Edward thought about Oliver's joy showing Jerome the laptop, Sophie's pride serving soup, the way both children had blossomed in that humble space. "I don't know," he admitted. That evening, after the children were asleep, Edward sat in his study going through Catherine's things, boxes he'd had moved to storage after her death, too painful to sort through. In one, he found her journals. The entries were dated, starting from when they first met. He skipped forward, looking for mentions of the shelter, and found them scattered throughout like hidden treasures. "The children at the shelter remind me why we're working so hard. Not for stock prices, but for human faces. Edward made another million today. I taught a grandmother to read her first complete sentence. I want to tell you about the Christmas party, but he's so stressed about the Tokyo deal. Maybe after. Sometimes I feel like I'm living 2 lives, the one Edward sees and the one that actually feeds my soul." That last entry was dated a week before her accident. Edward closed the journal, his chest tight with grief and regret. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Oliver stood in the doorway in his dinosaur pajamas. "Can't sleep?" Edward asked. Oliver shook his head, coming to climb into Edward's lap, something he hadn't done in over a year. "Dad, are you mad at Amara?" "No, son. Why would you think that? I heard you talking earlier. About the board wanting her fired." Oliver's voice was small. "If she leaves, who will take care of us?" "I will," Edward said automatically. Oliver pulled back to look at him. "But you're always working, or traveling, or in meetings." The truth of it sat between them, undeniable. "Amara says you work hard to take care of us," Oliver continued. "That making money is how you show love. But Dad, we'd rather have you." Edward held his son tighter. "I'm trying to do better." "Is that why you came to the shelter? To do better?" "Something like that." Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom would have been happy you came." "How do you know about Mom and the shelter?" "Amara told us. She said Mom believed in helping people, and that we carry her heart now, so we should help people too." Oliver yawned. "Is that true?" "Yes," Edward said softly. "That's true." After Oliver went back to bed, Edward opened his laptop and began working on something he hadn't done in years. A presentation that wasn't about profits or projections, but about people. Monday arrived with the kind of summer storm that turned streets into rivers and made the city feel like it was drowning. Edward stood at his office window, watching rain slash against the glass, while behind him, 12 board members sat around the conference table like judges at a tribunal. "This is unacceptable," Victor was saying, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded explosions. The stock dropped 3 points. 3 points? Edward, because investors think you've gone soft. Or because they think we've grown a conscience, Edward replied, not turning from the window. Companies don't have consciences. They have bottom lines. Edward finally turned, taking in the faces around the table. He'd worked with these people for years, celebrated victories with them, strategized through disasters. But looking at them now, he wondered if any of them had ever served soup to a hungry child or washed a poor person's shoes. "The shelter stays," he said simply. Edward, Richard Blackwood, the longest-serving board member, started. "The shelter stays," Edward repeated. "The rent freeze stands. This is not up for discussion." Victor stood slowly. "Everything is up for discussion when it affects shareholder value. You seem to have forgotten that you answer to this board. And you seem to have forgotten that I built this company." Edward's voice carried an edge that made several members shift uncomfortably. "From nothing. From one property and a vision." "Your vision didn't include charity cases," Victor shot back. Edward's phone buzzed. A text from Margaret, his assistant. "Grace Thompson is here for her interview. Also, your children are in the lobby with Ms. Johnson." The children. He'd forgotten Amara was bringing them for lunch after their morning lessons. "I need 5 minutes," Edward said. "We're not done here," Victor warned. 5 minutes. Edward left before anyone could object. In the elevator, he loosened his tie, trying to shift from corporate warrior to father. The doors opened to reveal chaos. The normally pristine lobby was packed with people, all of them soaking wet, all of them clearly seeking shelter from a storm. And in the middle of it all were his children, helping Amara and Margaret hand out towels from the executive bathroom. "Daddy," Sophie spotted him first. "The rain is really bad, and all these people were stuck at the bus stop, and Ms. Margaret said they could come inside." Edward looked at Margaret, his usually composed assistant who was now distributing his personal coffee supply to bedraggled strangers. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry, but the bus stop shelter collapsed, and they had nowhere to." "It's fine," Edward said, surprising himself. He spotted Grace Thompson standing nervously by the reception desk, her interview outfit carefully maintained despite the weather. "Mrs. Thompson, I apologize for the chaos. Shall we?" But before Grace could answer, the elevator dinged. Victor emerged, followed by 3 other board members. "What in the hell is this?" Victor's voice cut through the lobby chatter. Everyone froze. The homeless people, the business people trying to enter the building, Edward's children, all turned to stare. "These people need shelter from the storm," Edward said evenly. "These people need to leave. Now." Victor turned to security. "Remove them." "Belay that," Edward commanded. The security guards looked between the 2 executives, clearly uncomfortable. "You can't be serious," Victor said. "This is a place of business, not a homeless shelter. At the moment, it's both." "Mr. Whitmore?" Grace's voice was small. Should I come back another time?" "No," Edward said firmly. "We have an appointment." He looked at Victor. "Unless you'd like to explain to the board why we're turning away qualified candidates because of weather." Victor's face was turning an interesting shade of red. "This is about more than weather, and you know it. You've lost perspective, Edward, ever since that Maid started filling your children's heads with. Choose your next words very carefully." Edward's voice was deadly quiet. "Daddy," Oliver had moved closer, picking up on the tension. "Is everything okay?" Edward looked down at his son, then at Sophie, who was clutching Amara's hand. Behind them, the lobby full of people watched like an audience at a play. "Everything's fine," he said, then made a decision that would change everything. "Oliver, would you please show Mrs. Thompson to conference room B? Sophie, help Ms. Margaret get more towels. I need to finish something upstairs." "The board is still waiting," Victor said. Then let's not keep them waiting. Back in the boardroom, the atmosphere was arctic. Edward didn't sit, instead standing at the head of the table where he could see both the board and, through the window, the city drowning in rain. "I've made my decision about the shelter," he began. "Your decision?" Sandra Phillips, CFO, interrupted. "This affects all of us." "Yes, it does." Edward pulled up his presentation on the screen, "which is why you need to see this." The first slide showed the Riverside factory in its heyday, workers streaming through the gates, families at company picnics, productivity charts showing steady success. "This was one of our first major acquisitions," Edward narrated. "Profitable, stable, employing 3,000 people." The next slide showed the closure announcement, the profit projections from moving operations overseas, the stock price jump that followed. "We made $42 million in additional profit the first year," Edward continued. "A tremendous success." The next slide made several board members gasp. It was a collage of photos from the shelter, the same workers from the factory photos now in food lines. Families in the clothing donation room. Children doing homework in the shelter's quiet room because they had no home to go to. "These are the same people," Edward said unnecessarily. "Our profit came from their devastation." "That's business," Victor said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Is it?" Edward clicked to the next slide. Catherine's photo from the shelter, surrounded by children. "My wife understood something I forgot. That business without humanity isn't success. It's just greed wearing a suit." "Edward," Richard said gently, "we all respected Catherine, but nothing. My children spent Saturday at that shelter, serving soup to people we put out of work. My 8-year-old son asked me why some people have so much while others have nothing. What would you have told him?" Silence. "I'll tell you what I told him. Nothing. Because I had no good answer. Because there is no good answer that doesn't make us the villains in our own story." Victor stood. "This is emotional manipulation. We have a fiduciary duty. We have a human duty." Edward's control finally snapped. "My 6-year-old daughter has more compassion than this entire board combined. She gave her juice box to a homeless man, a man who worked for us for 32 years, and felt richer for it. When did we forget that?" His phone buzzed. A text from Oliver. "Mrs. Thompson is really nice. She fixed the conference room computer that's been broken for months." Edward almost smiled. Then his phone rang. "Margaret." "Sir, we have a situation. The storm damaged the shelter's roof. Ellen called. They're evacuating but have nowhere to take everyone." Edward looked at the board. The shelter's roof collapsed. "They need help. Not our problem," Victor said immediately. "Everything is our problem," Edward countered. "We own the building. We've deferred maintenance to maximize profits. This is literally our problem." He made another decision. "Margaret, send facilities management to the shelter immediately. And open the first 3 floors of this building for emergency shelter." "Sir, you heard me." He hung up and faced the board. "You want to vote me out? Fine. But do it knowing that you're choosing profits over people, spreadsheets over souls. Do it knowing that my children will grow up understanding that their father chose humanity when it mattered." "You're talking about liability," Sanders said. "Insurance issues, safety concerns. I'm talking about doing the right thing. Something this company forgot how to do when we started measuring success only in dollars." The room erupted in arguments. Board members shouting over each other. Victor demanding an immediate vote. Richard trying to restore order. In the chaos, Edward stepped out to the balcony despite the rain. The city sprawled below, gray and drowning. Somewhere out there, the shelter was evacuating. Families with nowhere to go. Children who would remember this day, either as when someone helped or when everyone turned away. His phone rang. "Amara." "The children want to help," she said simply. "They're gathering blankets from the supply closet. Sophie says we need to make the building feel welcoming." "Let them help," Edward said. "Mr. Whitmore." "Edward, are you sure about this?" The board will do what it does. But today, my children are going to see their father do what's right." He went back inside to find Victor on his phone, clearly rallying support for a vote. Other board members huddled in small groups, alliances forming and reforming. "Enough," Edward said. Everyone turned to him. "Here's what's going to happen. We're opening this building to shelter evacuees. We're fixing the shelter's roof properly, not patches. We're establishing a foundation separately funded to support the families affected by our business decisions. Any board member who objects is welcome to tender their resignation. You can't unilaterally, Victor started. I own 43% of shares, Edward interrupted. Combined with the institutional investors who've been pushing for corporate social responsibility, I have the votes. So yes, I can. This is insane, Victor said. No, Edward replied. Insane is my 6-year-old having more moral clarity than a room full of executives. Insane is my maid understanding my late wife's values better than I did. Insane is being so focused on profit that we forgot we're human. The boardroom door opened. Oliver peered in, eyes wide. Dad, the shelter people are here. Sophie's showing them where the bathrooms are. Can I help set up cots in the conference rooms? Edward looked at his son, earnest, kind, wanting to help. Then he looked at the board. Yes, he said, you can help. As Oliver disappeared, Edward turned back to the board. I'm going to help my children set up emergency shelter for the people we displaced. You can join us, or you can sit here debating quarterly projections while the city drowns. Your choice. He walked out, leaving 12 of the city's most powerful people sitting in stunned silence. Downstairs, the lobby had transformed into a refugee center. Families clustered together, volunteers he didn't recognize organizing supplies, his own employees helping where they could. In the center of it all, Sophie was handing out cookies from the executive kitchen, while Amara directed traffic with calm efficiency. Mr. Whitmore, Ellen appeared, soaked and exhausted. I can't thank you enough. Don't thank me, Edward said. I should have done this years ago. Grace Thompson approached, holding employment paperwork. I got the job, she said, tears streaming down her face. I start Wednesday. How can I ever? Just do good work, Edward said. That's all. His phone buzzed constantly, board members, reporters who'd gotten wind of the story, his sister demanding to know if he'd lost his mind. He ignored them all. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and helped Oliver set up cots. He carried soup from the kitchen with Sophie. He stood beside Amara as she coordinated with city services. And when Victor finally came downstairs, saw the chaos and humanity filling the pristine corporate lobby, and announced he was calling an emergency shareholder meeting, Edward just nodded. Do what you need to do, he said. Then he went back to helping an elderly woman find a dry place for her few possessions. Because for the first time in 3 years, maybe longer, Edward Whitmore knew exactly where he belonged. Dawn came slowly to the Whitmore Holdings building, revealing a scene that would have been unimaginable a week ago. The marble lobby, usually echoing with the footsteps of executives, was filled with sleeping families on cots. Edward stood by the window, holding his third cup of coffee, watching Sophie carefully place her teddy bear next to a sleeping toddler. You've been up all night, Amara said quietly, appearing beside him with a fresh cup. Couldn't sleep. Edward accepted the coffee gratefully. Victor's called the emergency shareholder meeting for 9 a.m. And you're not preparing? Edward gestured to the lobby. I am preparing, just not the way he expects. His phone buzzed. 17 messages from his legal team, 12 from PR, 43 from investors. He scrolled past them all to find one from Oliver. Dad, come to conference room A important. Edward found his son with Grace Thompson and Jerome, huddled around a laptop. We did it, Oliver announced. Jerome and I built a website for the shelter. Look, on the screen was a simple but elegant site, Hope Harbor, building bridges in our community. It featured photos from the shelter, stories from residents, and a donation portal. It went live an hour ago, Jerome said shyly. We've already raised $3,000. $3,000. Edward stared at the screen. Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. People want to help. They just needed to know how. Edward's phone rang. Richard Blackwood. Edward, you need to see the news. The conference room TV came to life, showing a morning news program. The anchor was speaking over footage of the Whitmore Holdings building. Families entering, employees helping, Edward himself carrying cots. In an unprecedented move, Whitmore Holdings CEO Edward Whitmore has converted his corporate headquarters into an emergency shelter following storm damage to the Hope Harbor Community Shelter. The question on everyone's mind: is this genuine corporate responsibility or a PR stunt gone too far? The report cut to an interview with Victor standing outside the building. The board is deeply concerned about Mr. Whitmore's recent erratic behavior. We have a responsibility to shareholders. Edward muted it. Oliver, can your website handle more traffic? Jerome made it scalable, Oliver said proudly. Good. Edward pulled out his phone and started typing. Because it's about to get a lot more. He posted the link on his rarely used social media account with a simple message. My children taught me that wealth means nothing if it doesn't help others. Every dollar donated goes directly to Hope Harbor. Within minutes, the post had hundreds of shares. Mr. Whitmore. Margaret appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. The boardroom is filling up. And she paused. There are news trucks outside. A lot of them. Edward looked at his children, Oliver excited about his website, Sophie now teaching Lulu a clapping game in the corner. Then he looked at Amara, steady as always. Let's go face the music, he said. The boardroom was packed, not just with board members, but with major shareholders. Some Edward recognized, others he didn't. Victor stood at the presentation screen, his slides showing projected losses, liability concerns, risk assessments. As you can see, Victor was saying, Mr. Whitmore's recent actions have put the entire company at risk. The stock has dropped 7% in pre-market trading. 8% now, someone called out, checking their phone. Edward entered quietly, taking his seat without fanfare. Victor's eyes found him immediately. Good of you to join us, Edward. We were just discussing your unilateral decision to turn our headquarters into a homeless shelter. Emergency shelter, Edward corrected. And yes, I made that decision. I'd make it again. Even knowing the liability, the insurance issues, the impact on our reputation. Edward stood slowly. May I? Victor stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Edward pulled up his phone, connecting it to the screen. The first thing that appeared was the donation counter from Oliver's website, now showing $47,000 and climbing. This is what my 8-year-old son built this morning, Edward said. While we've been debating liability, he's been solving problems. He swiped to the next screen. Social media posts, hundreds of them, praising Whitmore Holdings for finally showing humanity. Our reputation, he continued, has never been stronger with actual humans. Yes, the stock is down. But look closer. He pulled up detailed trading data. The selling is primarily from algorithmic trading and short-term speculators. Our institutional investors, the pension funds, the ESG-focused funds, they're holding or buying. That's a gamble, Victor interrupted. Everything's a gamble. Edward moved to the window, gesturing for them to look down. But those people aren't a gamble. There's certainty. They're here. They're real. And they're our responsibility. Our responsibility? Sandra Phillips stood. Edward, we're not a charity. No, we're not. We're something more powerful. We're a company with resources, expertise, and influence. We can make real change. Or lose everything trying, Victor countered. Edward's phone buzzed. A message from Ellen. Channel 6 wants to interview someone from Whitmore Holdings. They're asking about the factory closure. Edward turned back to the board. The media wants to talk about the Riverside factory, about how our profit came from those people's pain. We can deny it, spin it, or we can own it and fix it. He pulled up a new presentation, one he'd worked on through the night. The Whitmore Foundation, he announced. Separately funded, independently governed. Initial endowment of $50 million for my personal holdings. Gasps around the room. You're insane, Victor said flatly. The foundation will focus on workforce retraining, emergency assistance, and community development. But more than that, it will be a model for how corporations can profit while still being human. And if it fails? Richard asked quietly. Then I fail. My money, my risk. But the company continues as is, with one change. We commit to responsible property management. No more predatory rent increases. No more closures without transition planning. The shareholders will revolt, Sandra predicted. Edward's phone buzzed again, this time from an unexpected source. William Sterling, CEO of Sterling Investments, one of their largest institutional investors. "Put me on speaker, Edward." Edward complied, placing his phone on the table. "William," Victor said smoothly, "we're in the middle of—" "I know what you're in the middle of," Sterling's voice filled the room. "I'm watching the news. My question is simple. Does Whitmore Holdings stand with Edward or against him?" "The board has concerns," Victor started. "The market has concerns too. But you know what? My daughter just donated her entire allowance to that shelter website. She's 7. If a 7-year-old can see the right path, why can't you?" The line went dead. Before anyone could respond, Margaret entered again. "Mr. Whitmore, Grace Thompson needs you." "There's a situation in the lobby." Edward found Grace, trying to comfort an elderly black man who was clearly distressed. "This is Henry," Grace explained. "He worked at Riverside for 40 years. He's trying to give this back." Henry held out a trembling hand. And it was a gold watch, a retirement gift from the company, Edward realized. "I don't want nothing from the people who threw me away," Henry said, his voice rough. 40 years. Perfect attendance. Then nothing. Edward knelt beside the man's chair. Ignoring the cameras, he could see filming through the glass doors. "I can't undo what we did," Edward said quietly. "I can't give you those years back or restart the factory. But I can promise you this, your 40 years mattered. They built something, even if we forgot that for a while." Henry studied him with eyes that had seen too much. Pretty words don't feed families. "No, they don't." Edward pulled out his phone, called his CFO. "Sandra, I need you to pull the records for all Riverside employees. Full pension restoration, backdated to closure with interest." "Edward, that's necessary. Make it happen." He hung up and looked back at Henry. "Keep the watch. You earned it. And starting next month, you'll have the pension you earned too." Henry's eyes filled with tears. Around them, other former Riverside employees had gathered, listening. "All of us," someone asked. "All of you," Edward confirmed. The lobby erupted in a mixture of tears, cheers, and disbelief. Through it all, Edward saw Oliver and Sophie watching from the stairs, Amara behind them. Sophie gave him a thumbs up. His phone rang. "Victor, you just committed millions without board approval. I committed to honoring obligations we should never have abandoned. The board is voting. Get up here." Edward climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. In the boardroom, ballots were being distributed. "The motion," Richard announced formally, "is to remove Edward Whitmore as CEO for fiscal irresponsibility and failure to uphold fiduciary duty." One by one, board members marked their ballots. Edward didn't watch. Instead, he looked out at the city, at the clearing sky, at the news vans below. "The votes," Richard announced after counting. "4 in favor of removal. 8 against. The motion fails." Victor stood abruptly. "This is a mistake. You're choosing sentiment over sense." "We're choosing humanity over heartlessness," Richard corrected. "Something we should have done long ago." Victor gathered his papers. "I'll have my resignation on your desk within the hour." "Accepted," Edward said simply. As Victor left, Edward's phone lit up with notifications. The donation website had crossed $100,000. The stock had stopped falling, stabilizing as Sterling Investments announced they were increasing their position. In a text from Amara, "The children want to know if their friends can stay for lunch." 6 months later, Edward stood in the same spot where he'd first seen his children on that shabby street. But everything had changed. The Hope Harbor Community Shelter gleamed with fresh paint and new windows. A garden bloomed where cracked concrete used to be, Sophie and Oliver's project, now tended by dozens of small hands. "Daddy, hurry up," Sophie called from the entrance. "The ceremony's starting." Edward smiled, adjusting the simple polo shirt he wore instead of his usual suit. Casual Fridays had become casual most days as the culture at Whitmore Holdings shifted. Inside, the shelter buzzed with activity. The main room was packed for the ribbon cutting of the new wing, the Catherine Whitmore Learning Center, funded entirely by the foundation. "Mr. Whitmore." Jace ran up, taller now, wearing a school uniform Edward recognized from Preston Academy. The foundation scholarship program had opened doors that poverty had slammed shut. "It's just Edward, Jace." "How's school?" "Great." Oliver's helping me with advanced math. Did you know your son's kind of a genius? Edward laughed. I'm learning all kinds of things about my children lately. He found Oliver in the computer lab, teaching a coding class to a dozen eager students. Jerome was his assistant, the two boys having become inseparable friends despite the 4-year age gap. Dad, look, Oliver pulled him over to see their latest project, an app that connected shelter resources with families in need. It's already helped 50 families find services. Your mother would be so proud, Edward said, ruffling his son's hair. She is proud, Sophie announced, appearing with Amara. I talk to her picture every night and tell her what we did. Last night, I told her about the garden producing its first tomatoes. Amara smiled, her new lanyard reading Director of Community Programs, Whitmore Foundation, catching the light. She'd accepted the position only after Edward guaranteed complete autonomy and a board that included shelter residents. 5 minutes to ceremony, she informed him. Your speech is on the podium. I'm not using it, Edward decided. I'll speak from the heart. That's new, Amara observed with gentle humor. Lots of things are new. The ceremony began with Ellen welcoming everyone, thanking the foundation, the volunteers, and especially the Whitmore children who reminded us all that kindness doesn't check bank accounts. When Edward took the podium, he looked out at the crowd, former Riverside employees, shelter residents, his own executives, now required to volunteer monthly, and in the front row, his children beaming up at him. 6 months ago, he began, I returned early from a business trip expecting to find my world exactly as I'd left it. Instead, I found my children on a street I'd never have chosen for them, learning lessons I'd never thought to teach. I was angry. I was scared. I was wrong. Murmurs through the crowd. My wife Catherine understood something I'd forgotten. That wealth without purpose is just hoarding with better PR. My children, guided by someone wiser than their father, he nodded to Amara, learned that same lesson. Today, we're not just cutting a ribbon. We're admitting that the old way of doing business, profit without people, success without soul, is dead. Tell them about Field Fridays, Sophie called out, making everyone laugh. Yes, Field Fridays, Edward smiled. Every Whitmore Holdings executive now spends one Friday a month in the field. Here, at other shelters, at job training sites. My CFO, Sandra, learned to serve meals. Our new COO, Marcus, you all know him as my former driver. He teaches job interview skills. Marcus waved from the crowd, his promotion from chauffeur to COO still the talk of the business world. But more importantly, Edward continued, we've learned that investing in people isn't charity. It's the best business decision we've ever made. Our workforce retraining program has provided skilled employees for our own operations. Our housing initiative has created stable communities where our businesses thrive. Turns out, when people do better, companies do better. He saw Grace in the crowd, now a supervisor in quality control, her children beside her in their school uniforms. We can't undo the past, Edward said, but we can build a different future. One where 8-year-olds like my Oliver don't have to ask why some have so much while others have nothing. One where 6-year-olds like my Sophie can share their juice boxes without it being remarkable. I still share juice boxes, Sophie announced proudly. Yes, you do, Edward laughed. And you've taught your father that sharing doesn't diminish us, it defines us. After the ceremony, as people toured the new learning center, Edward found himself in the computer lab watching Oliver and Jerome teach younger kids to code. Sophie was in the art room, painting alongside Lulu, both girls covered in cheerful splatters. They're different children than they were a year ago, Amara observed, joining him. We all are, Edward replied. His phone buzzed, the board meeting in an hour. But could wait a few more minutes. Mr. Whitmore, Henry, the 40-year Riverside veteran, approached with a younger woman. This is my granddaughter, Denise. She just graduated from college, thanks to your foundation scholarship. Engineering degree. Denise shook his hand firmly. I start at Whitmore Holdings next week. Design department. Welcome to the team, Edward said warmly. As the afternoon wore on, Edward moved through the shelter, no longer an outsider, but part of the fabric. He helped serve lunch, read to toddlers in the quiet room, even attempted Sophie's clapping game with limited success. You're getting better, Mr. Thomas told him, still a regular, though no longer homeless thanks to the Foundation's housing program. Still got no rhythm, but better. Story of my life, Edward agreed. That evening, back at the estate, Edward found his children in the kitchen with Amara, making sandwiches for tomorrow's shelter lunch, a tradition they'd maintained despite having a full staff. "Dad, can Jace and Jerome come for dinner Friday?" Oliver asked. "Of course. Who else should we invite?" "Everyone," Sophie exclaimed. "Everyone." "Well, maybe not everyone," Oliver said practically. "The dining room only holds 20. They settled on 12 guests, a mix of shelter friends, former Riverside employees, and new Foundation staff. It had become their new normal. These dinners where factory workers sat beside executives, where children ran freely between courses, where the massive dining room finally felt full. Later, Edward stood in his study, the same room where he'd once plotted Amara's termination, where he'd tried to control his children's world with rules and walls. The space had changed too. Catherine's photos from a shelter now hung prominently. Children's artwork decorated the serious wooden panels. And on his desk, beside the financial reports and merger proposals, sat a hand-painted paperweight from Sophie that read "World's Most Improved Dad." A knock interrupted his thoughts. Oliver and Sophie entered in their pajamas. "Bedtime story?" Sophie asked hopefully. "Aren't you getting too old for bedtime stories?" Edward teased. "Never," both children declared. They curled up on either side of him in the big leather chair as Edward pulled out a worn book, one of Catherine's favorites he'd found in her things. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a king who had everything but happiness." "Like you were," Sophie interrupted. "Like I was," Edward agreed. Until two brave children and one wise teacher showed him that the key to happiness wasn't in holding tight to what he had, but in opening his hands to share it. Oliver finished, having heard this interpretation before. Exactly. As he read, Edward thought about tomorrow, the board meeting about expanding the Foundation, Grace's presentation on quality improvements, the shelter's weekend programs. There would be challenges, setbacks, criticism from those who preferred the old ways. But tonight, with his children warm against his sides and their friends' artwork on his walls, Edward Whitmore was exactly where he belonged. Not above the world in his ivory tower, but in it, part of it, made better by it. "Dad," Sophie said sleepily as the story ended. "I'm glad you came home early that day." "Me too, sweetheart." "Me too." Through the window, the lights of the city twinkled, each one a life, a story, a potential connection. The estate's gates stood open now, the careful boundaries dissolved. In the distance, Edward could see the shelter, lit warmly against the night, a beacon of what was possible when wealth met wisdom, when privilege met purpose. The millionaire had returned from his trip, seen his children in the street, and frozen. But in that frozen moment, something had thawed, his heart, his perspective, his understanding of what truly mattered. And in the thawing, a family had been reborn, a company transformed, a community healed. The beginning. If you had all the wealth in the world, but your children grew up without compassion, what legacy would you really be leaving behind? If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters.